the book of Daniel, how a great empire would rise and then fall, and out of these 10 horns of division, a religious beast would begin to emerge. Both are called Rome. Rome the empire, and Rome the Catholic or universal religion of the Roman beast. So this beast we see up in the right-hand corner, if you'll remember, we see on the, how many horns we see there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 8 horns, right? There's one right in the middle of his head. There was 10 to begin with, which we don't see. When the one had risen, the 11th horn, the one with the face on it, rose up. 3 of them were uprooted. I don't know if you were here or if you remember, we went over that. But that comes from the book of Daniel. Anyway, the one right there on top of his head with the eyes and the nose and the mouth, that is the Antichrist, or the Antichrist system, or the Antichrist kingdom. And the Antichrist is actually twofold, and we talked about that. We said there's a Catholic element, there's a Muslim element to this Antichrist kingdom that will be the end fulfillment. But the book of Daniel gave us some keys here. We went through it. I don't remember exactly where it was in our study. It was before we got to Thyatira. But if you don't remember, go back. But here's 10 key points that we picked out of that study. Number 1, we found out it was going to be a worldwide power. Number 2, it had to be a religious beast, or there was some type of religious element to it. Number 3, it arises among 10 horns. It must arise after 476 A.D., and it plucked up 3 horns by the roots. It would be a man speaking great things. You can see number 8 there. He speaks blasphemy. We went over blasphemy. What is blasphemy? And this kingdom would be diverse or different from anything that we've ever seen before, any other kingdom that we ever had seen before. It persecutes the saints for 3.5 years. We all know there's a tribulation period. Tribulation period consists of 7 years. In the Antichrist, for the first 3.5 years, the final manifestation of the Antichrist, who we call the Antichrist, he will emerge. And for the first 3.5 years, he won't really persecute the Christian, or not Christian, but the people of God at that time. But after the 2 witnesses are gone, there's nothing to stop him, and literally all hell breaks loose upon those who are here. And it says he persecutes the saints for 3.5 years. Well, we even talk about saints, because we got in a couple weeks ago, we were talking about, people praying to Saint Gabriel and Saint Michael and Saint Raphael and Saint this and Saint that. We said, those aren't the saints. The people of God are the saints according to the Bible, not these statues. And really, when you pray to a statue, you're praying to some type of spirit anyway behind that statue. And number 10, this Antichrist would think to change laws and times. And so those were 10 keys that came out of our study when we went in and we looked at this rising up, just to remind you. And we also talked about those 10 horns. They're listed on the next slide. Oh, wait, before we go, underneath the map, you have the statue there, which is Nebuchadnezzar's image that he saw in the dream. Daniel said that the image represented all these kingdoms, and you can see there at the feet of this image is a stone, and that stone represented Jesus striking the image, the Messiah coming, striking the image in his feet, and it would collapse. So it represents these kingdoms until the end time, beginning with the head, which was Babylon. But then you can see when the Roman Empire was there, after Jesus had already visited the earth and he ascended into heaven, and then we see where the Roman Empire stopped persecuting the Christians and became Constantine came in, and the Roman Empire was divided, and there was 2 divisions from the east and the west, and you can see that the statue there has 2 legs. So all this is kind of like a reminder. So then when we go to the next slide here, We also talked about those 10 horns. 3 were uprooted. They were the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. The Antichrist kingdom could not come into existence until those were uprooted. And the ones that remained, of course, you don't have to know what the names are on the left there, but they became the Germans, the Swiss, the French, the Italians, the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. They still exist even to this day. The rest of this stuff should be, that was kind of a repeat. The rest of this stuff should be relatively new then. I don't think we've covered any of this. But this person here, this is Saint Augustine, or known as Saint Augustine of Canterbury. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Anyway, when we talk about saint this or saint that, there's these ones like we mentioned, there's the ones that they pray to that are supposed to be in heaven, and then there's ones who they refer to in their writings as saint this and saint that on this earth. If we're in a church, we're all saints. So don't let that throw you. But there is a historical person called Saint Augustine of Canterbury, and this Augustine of Canterbury was a Benedictine monk who became the first Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 597 A.D. And now Pope Gregory the Great sent him to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And when he got there, he reported that there were savage barbarians which existed throughout England. And Augustine was made the bishop then and given authority over all future English bishops. So isn't that something? So the Pope sent him there, and then he gave him the authority over all future English bishops. You see how this outstretching of this authority, how Rome is trying to take authority even over England. Now we know from history what happened, right? The Anglican Church of England actually ended up coming out of it a complete split from Rome, and we'll see that later. But Rome never did really have the authority that they pretended to have. There was, they claimed that when Jesus said to Peter, "Your name is Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," it really is. If you understand Greek, it's a joke. It's such a joke because they say the name Peter was Petra, which is a rock, but really the name Peter actually the literal meaning was a small pebble. The rock was Jesus. The rock was, we saw the rock with the image that was coming down to hit the statue, right, in the feet. That was the Messiah. And when Jesus was comparing himself and the gospel message that he brought with Peter, he said, "But you are just a small pebble." And he said, "But upon this rock," he meant himself and the word of God, "upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And so how they ever succeeded in causing people to believe that from that Peter was given the keys of heaven all by himself. No, the 12 apostles were given the keys of the kingdom. Then they were sent into the world, and they had the authority sent out by God. There was not 11 apostles plus one was in charge. There were 12 apostles. They were all equal. And out of those 12 apostles sprang forth the entire Christian church and all the authority that goes back up to Jesus. And you know what? Jesus is in heaven. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. But he is on the throne. He is still alive. And he's still the boss. Amen. Who's the one in the music industry they call the boss? Yeah. What is the name again? Bruce Springsteen. Well, Jesus is the real boss. That's right. Okay? There's no Bruce Springsteen Springsteen is the boss. Jesus is the boss. The vicar of Christ is not the boss. The Pope is not the boss. Jesus is still alive. He's still on the throne. He dispatches us, right? He's still in control. So anyway, let's look at, well, what did this Augustine, what did he actually do? He was dispatched to England. The Pope said he had authority over all the future English bishops, but Let me enlighten you to what St. Augustine did. When he went out there, he massacred all these Celtic Christians. You say Celtic or Celtic, you can pronounce it either. I've heard it pronounced either way. So the Celts permitted their clergy to marry, and they were Christians. Why would the Pope have Augustine massacre Christians because they weren't Catholic? It is exactly right. Because according to Rome, there is no Christianity outside Rome. That has never changed. Even though they'll tell you, well, we're ecumenical now, we're trying to work things out and bring everybody. No, they're trying to bring everybody under the umbrella of Catholicism, but don't you think for a minute that anything has ever changed. When they get enough power, they will do the same thing that they've done in the past. And God gave us, He shows us the history and the evidence of what this beast that rose up, what this beast did, he will continue to do. He's just kind of at bay right now. Remember the scripture said the beast would suffer a wound, and he would almost be like a mortal wound, almost put out of commission, then all of a sudden he comes back in vengeance. And that's what's going to happen. We're actually seeing the rising back of the power of the papacy. And now we're going to consider what they've done. But anyway, the reason the Celts were massacred, here were the points. They permitted their clergy to marry. You're the first one to go, Pastor. Because you're married, and according to the Catholic Church, if you're a priest, you have to be celibate. Which is funny because the Bible says Peter had a wife. So they say he's the first pope, yet he had a wife. Well, we don't even want to get into that. We don't even want to get. Okay, so I think we'll skip the sexual part, but. Because we could talk about that the rest of the night. There's all kinds of stories, right? But I'm not here to speak about that. But I want to talk about factual stuff here. Another thing here's what these Celts were guilty of. They refused to use the Roman Latin Vulgate translation of the Scripture. So, according to the Vatican, according to the papacy, they were guilty and they should be put to death because they wouldn't use the Latin translation, which was approved by the Pope. The third thing they did is they honored the seventh day as the Sabbath instead of Sunday. By all means, they should be killed for that. So they were massacred by this Augustine. And yet, if you talk about, even throughout the Protestant world, if you mention St. Augustine, they think he was a good guy. Because we've forgotten. See, what's happened is throughout the churches, in the last 50 years, you don't hear anybody teaching about anything. The things we're teaching, and it's hard to get copies of the history of the things that happened. They're trying to change the history. They refuse to accept the Sunday as the new Sabbath day, which previously we showed how one of the popes, I don't remember which one, but he commanded that everyone worship on Sunday. Sunday or Saturday, that's not the point. The point is you don't kill somebody and massacre a whole people because the day they worship. The fourth thing, they refuse to honor the Pope or award him a place of authority. Well, I'm guilty of that. So, one of these days maybe they'll come and get me. I don't know. But they'll get him first because he's the pastor. What did you say?
I was being silly. I said, off with your head.
Off with your head. So anyway, these Celts, the ones that survived, they fled to Ireland, northeast of England, to run away from Catholicism and the Roman Church. From there, they sent out, these are the Celts, they sent out many missionaries to northern Germany and established many churches. Even they suffered all this persecution, but they continued to doing the work of Christ. These same Celtic Christians would eventually be brutally massacred in Germany several years later by who? The Roman Church through St. Boniface. And so they didn't escape, they just ran. They created churches as they went, and then Rome sent out another St. Boniface and massacred them in Germany. And the reason, again, because they allowed their pastors to marry, they wouldn't use the Latin Vulgate, they worshipped on the seventh day, and they refused to honor the Pope. Early in the 7th century, Roman Catholic authorities in Great Britain, with their secular allies, persecuted Bible-believing Celtic Christians in Britain and on the European continent. On one occasion, 1,200 British Celtic Christians were slaughtered by a pagan army at the instigation of Roman Catholic clergy. I think I have a slide here where I have something underlined here, and from a historical book here. So I'm going to read that and pay special attention to what's underlined. True to form at the meeting, Augustine remained contemptuously seated, and no headway was made in shackling the British Church to the rule of Rome. Thus rebuffed, watch this, Augustine issued the spiteful threat, if we may not preach the way of life to you, you shall at hands of your enemies undergo their vengeance. This evil later came to pass under Augustine's successor in 613 AD, inspiring Saxon allies to slaughter about 1,200 Celtic churchmen from the great Culdy Abbey at Bangor on Dee as they defenselessly knelt praying in a field. And so it goes on and on. But this slaughtering of the Celtic Christians, this is undeniable. And it wasn't just the Celts. It happened to many others as well. Now, this next person, you won't recognize the picture because it's kind of fictitious, but kind of looks a little evil to me. This is supposed to represent the Prophet Muhammad. And you remember we talked about Catholicism. The papacy is rising up about the same time Islam is rising up. Because he's born in 569, 570 AD, around there. And you can see in his hands there he's got the Koran. And he's bringing a new Bible. Okay? His personal agenda was to tear down all the idolatry throughout the world, much of which was being ushered in by the organized church. Isn't that something? I mean, the Bible told us, thou shalt not worship images and icons. And when Muhammad came, he fueled the passion of the Islam by saying, look at them worshiping idols, which obviously Moses forbid. In other words, there would not have been any fuel. There wouldn't have been any passion behind the Muslims to attack idolatry if there was no idolatry in the church. They were sent forth to tear down idolatry, and he could point to the words of Moses and said, look, this is obviously can't be the truth. And so we kind of set ourselves up, and I'd say we set it, but I'm including us as the church in general, by not giving heed to the words and going and worshiping idols. We set ourselves up to be punished by Islam. I kind of wonder if God didn't send the Muslims in the first place just to wake us up and chastise us. And I speak us again as the organized church. And said, what are you doing? In fact, there was even the emperors that they had a movement called the iconoclasts, where emperors in the Roman Empire arose and said, tear down these images. This is not of God. And they only lasted a small time until Rome could get their image-loving popes back in power, or emperors back in power. This next slide here. This represents a change in doctrinal belief. Remember, it's interesting that we spoke in Thyatira on the second week. We spoke about the millennial kingdom. We talked about the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, right? And it's interesting that this came up at that time. I had no, I didn't know we would even bring this up at this time. So it's kind of interesting way the Spirit brought that out. But this doctrine of postmillennialism came in about this time as well. What postmillennialism is that the belief that Jesus would come, and that but he would come in the way the Catholic Church modified it, was that Jesus would come in the essence or the manifestation through the papacy, and the millennial kingdom would be or come forth out of the papacy, ushering in 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. And so what did they do? They gave up on the original doctrine of the second coming of Christ, ushering in that millennial kingdom. In fact, you can go throughout the churches throughout this country. There's very few churches that actually believe in a literal 1,000-year kingdom that Christ will set up here upon the earth. Now, we could argue, and some people say, well, some people, believe this, and some people believe that, and it doesn't really matter. Well, here's the problem. The New Testament talks about 1,000-year millennium. All of the Old Testament prophets do. God spent all these words. He spoke to the prophets, all these words he had written down to tell us about the millennial kingdom. And now what, he changed his mind? Now it's not going to happen? Now this could seem funny, but remember Jesus said this. He said, you will give an account of every idle word. God doesn't speak idle words. Everything in the book, every word of God has to come to pass. Every prophecy in the book has to come to pass. And so everything that talks about this millennial kingdom has to come to pass. That temple in the book of Ezekiel that takes up about 10 chapters has to be built. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It has to be. Now here we have Stephen II. It's about 752 A.D. He requested that Pepin, the king of the Franks, would lead his army to Italy and conquer the Lombards, which had attacked and pillaged Italy. What happened is, remember, we saw the horns rise up, the 10 horns. 3 were uprooted. The papacy begins to rise. Rome is being attacked by barbarous tribes from all over. And Stephen convinces this Pepin, who's the king of the Franks at that time, to come and help him to attack these Lombards, which were attacking Italy. So Pepin was successful, and he gave a large portion of territory in central Italy to the Pope, which became the beginning of the Papal States. How many know that the Vatican is actually its own sovereign nation? It even has a chair and a place in the United Nations. It's recognized by all nations of the world. It's the only religious leader recognized by every nation, including the United Nations. It has its own sovereignty. It has its own military. It has its own intelligence. How many have ever heard of the mafia? Is the mafia controlled? But some say, well, mafia doesn't exist anymore. Well, I don't buy that. I believe organized crime does not just go away; it just changes names. Anybody that thinks that there's no more crime or organized crime, it just changed. Their names change, the face change. Someone's got to be at the head of all this. This is when the Pope when the papacy became a sovereign nation. This is when they got all this land, all these papal states, and had their own sovereignty. This was the beginning of the kingdom, if you will. So the papacy had rightful dominion, and this continued for 1,100 years until King Victor Emmanuel returned territories to the nation of Italy in 1870. So in 1870, the papacy actually lost all those papal states. And many people believe that this is when papacy received a mortal wound. This was very destructive to the authority, because what happened is, how can you be a nation, a sovereign king, over territories that you don't own anymore? Could you imagine, let's just use Obama. King Obama, who's king over this country, the president, right? I'm just kind of being facetious, but we're just going to use him as an example. What if some other country came and took all 50 states away from him? How much authority would Obama have? Nothing. The only reason he has authority is because he reigns over 50 states, right? This is what happened to the Pope when they lost all of the states. It was a mortal wound on the head of the beast. And it looked like, if you were an observer, you would think that would be the end of the papacy. You know when it revived? During the days of Mussolini, right around World War II. So here you have Pope Gregory III, and he was in 740 AD. He asked Charles Martel, who was I believe he's a son of Pepin. We're talking about Pepin, who was the king of France. Charles Martel, he asked him to come to the Pope's aid against the Germanic tribes of the Lombards and the Muslims. I don't know how much you know about the Muslim kingdom, but this is why we brought up Muhammad. After Muhammad's birth came this Muslims. They began out of the Middle East, and they came down through Africa, all the way through the North Africa, and came up into Spain, and they began to attack Europe, and something had to be done. And so the papacy needed help, and so they got Charles Martel to come, and Charles Martel pushed them back into Africa. You wonder how did the Muslims ever get such a hold on the northern part of Africa? That's how they did it and when they did it. But note that by 721, the Emir of Cordoba had built up a strong army from Morocco, Yemen, and Syria to conquer Quitolin from the southwestern edge of France. The caliphate is called an empire. The Muslim empire, you can see how it started there in the Middle East. Anything towards the right of the Mediterranean Sea there was where it began. Well, actually, if you go down where Mecca was, and you can see the Muslims were on the right side of that map, and all of how the Muslims just spread out across North Africa. You can see on the left, the top of the map at the left top corner is where Spain is. They came all the way through there and then up into the northern part. Now, if we can't see too much the clarity of this map here, but when you see it on the video, you'll see that there's actually 3 different colors schemes on this map that shows how the spread of Islam actually grew. And over the years, it didn't take that long. It happened pretty quick, actually, and you could see how large. If you could see, because the Muslim Empire almost completely took over Spain. So from the one side of this map all the way to the other, that's how this is the Muslim caliphate, Islamic caliphate grew. This is what they're trying, when they talk about ISIS today, this is what they're trying to do today. They say ISIS is the new caliphate. This is what people even from our country are going over and joining forces because they're Muslim and they're being called. He said that Allah needs you now. Remember the posters we used to have with Uncle Sam? Uncle Sam wants you. Well, that's kind of what they're doing with Facebook and Twitter. He said, Allah wants you. And if you're true to Allah, then you should come and establish the caliphate. The reason this is so important, just like our Christianity has Bible prophecy about the end times, Islam has their own flavor of end-time prophecy. Actually, the Messiah, which they call the Mahdi, the Messiah of Islam is actually the biblical Antichrist. So the parallels are incredible. But Islam teaches that the Mahdi, the Savior, the Messiah, can't come until the caliphate, this Islamic caliphate, is reestablished, a new formation of a new empire. Now, we're going to get into later where we'll see that actually at World War I there was a Islamic caliphate in power. You wonder how the mosque got in Israel on the Temple Mount? It's because there was a Muslim caliphate. The Muslims took control over Jerusalem and they had it for years and years and years. In fact, that's what the Crusades was about, right? Trying to get the Pope wanted to free Jerusalem from Muslim control. Now, he didn't want to do it for the Jews. He wanted to do it for himself so that Rome could control it. Now, I don't know if you remember, but in Revelation chapter 13, there's actually two beasts. One rises up with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And then there's another beast that rises up afterwards, and he's got 2 horns. Remember, he had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. Here in this one, you see the 2 horns on his head, and you see that's like a serpent tongue coming out. He spoke like a serpent. But this is interesting that we call that beast a false prophet. And it has 2 horns. We know 2 horns represents 2 kings. Well, now let's bring up this next slide and you can see, here's the identity. The identity of these 2 horns on this second beast is actually Islam is one of the horns, and the other one is the papacy. And we can read in the picture there's Pope Gregory III. It doesn't mean he is the Antichrist. The papacy represents one of the horns, and Islam represents the other. They're both religions, though. And you could see what's going to happen eventually is the 2 will unite. And we read scriptures like, who is like the beast and who can fight against him? Is what they say, what the people scream out in the book of Revelation. But in Revelation chapter 11, we read here on this slide, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb. He spake as a dragon. Picture of on the right there, you see the Holy Quran. That's actually I scanned a copy of my own Quran. I have a copy of the Quran. But out of this Quran, there's a few verses. They're called surahs. In our Bible, we call the verses biblical verses. They call them surahs. I don't know why. But I'm going to look at Surah 65, Surah 70, and Surah 90 here on this slide. So I'll read it to you. But because I'm not expecting that any of you have a copy of the Quran, nor would I suggest that you do have a copy of the Quran. I have one just because I do. But actually, it was a gift from somebody. Of course, he turned against me when he realized that I didn't have any respect for it. But anyway, people of the book, many times, this is a phrase that occurs in the Quran. People of the book, go not beyond the bounds in your religion. The people of the book, and say not as to God, but the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only the messenger of God. So people of the book, don't go beyond the bounds of your religion. Don't say that Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, is anything other than simply a messenger of God. Remember John the epistle said, who's the Antichrist? The one who denies that Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Antichrist. He's the spirit of Antichrist. Now we just said, the reason I have this slide up here, we just said that Islam corresponds to one of the horns on the false prophet. The false prophet represents the religious system of the Antichrist. And where we see the spirit of Antichrist, right, coming out of the Quran here, where it says in Surah 65, the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only the messenger of God, nothing else. In other places it says God has no son. In Surah 70 it says, they say God has taken him a son. You have no authority for this. So when we say that God has a son and his name is Jesus and he was born of Mary the Virgin and he was crucified and he ascended into heaven, they say we have no authority to say that. What do you say concerning God that you know not? Those who forge against God falsehood shall not prosper. We shall let them taste the terrible chastisement, for they were unbelievers. In other words, this is the justification for Islam to come after anyone who claims that Jesus is the Son of God. You know, one of the unique things about Islam, has been pointed out by many people, is they behead people. And you can see it on the news, right? And you can see it, you can catch it on YouTube. Sometimes they put it on YouTube. They actually behead people. And they behead them for believing that Jesus is the Son of God. For not rejecting Christ and joining Allah and becoming Muslim. They believe they're justified because the Quran in chapter 70 says, we shall let them taste the terrible chastisement, for they were unbelievers. Why? Because they're saying that God took him a son. In Surah 90 it says, and they say, the All-Merciful has taken unto himself a son. You have indeed advanced something hideous. Well, there's 3 verses right there, but there's a lot more in the Quran. In fact, anyone can sit down, they can read the Quran, and they would have to conclude this is spirit of Antichrist. There's no 2 ways about it. And it's interesting how the 2 join later on. The 2 will join it together to support this Antichrist kingdom. So anyway, so what we brought up here, we had a picture, a slide. We had Pope Gregory the Great, who was around 590 through 604. He represented the papacy at the same time the Prophet Muhammad was born 569, 570. So right around that time, 590, he's rising up when he was in his 20s, and he represents the Prophet of Islam. Together, they will eventually, you can see it actually on the horns, you can see in yellow there on the horns, one says Catholicism, the other says Islam. I put that on there so you can see it. How many recognize this character? He's got John's favorite hat. I thought John he had become a member in the church, and I thought he was going to be given one of these hats. But here's the stuff that's interesting about what's happening right now. This is right out of headlines. Pope Francis declares that Christians and Muslims are brothers and sisters. Wow. Did you ever expect that the Pope would come out and make such an announcement? Interesting. Chrislam's Rick Warren. How many know who Rick Warren is? He's really famous in the church. He came out with that the book, Principles. Purpose-driven life, yeah, and it was big. It was big, and he's very popular in the Christian community. Anyway, we say Chrislam's Rick Warren because he's partnering with mosques to teach that God and Allah are the same. In other words, God and Allah are the same God.
So it's something to be aware of. If you ask a Muslim, if you say, what does Allah mean? And they would say God. But if you call God anything other than Allah, then they say it's unacceptable. You must call God by the name Allah. You can't. He said, Islam will say that Allah is the God of Abraham. But if you say, then Allah is equal to Jehovah, they would say, yes, but if you call God Jehovah, they say, no, you can't do that. You got to call him Allah. Because the name means God. Anyway, Rick Warren is trying to be helpful in getting mosques and Muslims to work together with Christians. And now these are all, this is where we live. This is all from this year. Pope Francis unites Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists to sign a pact with Rome. Let's all work together. And you can see this come. This is like unheard of. This is things that, I used to warn and I used to preach about these things that they were coming. They were coming. They were coming. And here today, I mean, you can imagine. My skin's about ready to come off my bones when I see this. To me, it's almost amazing to have known that this has to come, and then to see it, to actually emerging. And yet, it seems like the rest of the world and the rest of this country is almost silent. The rest of these denominations, who is speaking out against it? Very few people are speaking out against it. Evangelicals and Catholics together. How many heard this? On March 29, 1994, a joint declaration was signed called Evangelicals and Catholics Together, the Christian Mission in the Third Millennium. The compromise of the gospel lies at the heart of their agreement. But the gospel has not changed, or has it? According to what we're seeing with our eyes, according to what's developing, it seems like the gospel has changed. I've referred to this a few times as we've been going through this study. I don't know that I gave you the actual year that they signed, but major Christian denominations have signed a pact with the Catholic, with Roman Catholicism, with the Pope, that they will no longer teach anything against the Catholic Church. They will not teach that there's any association of Catholicism with Antichrist and the spirit of Antichrist. Yet this is going on. And so you're seeing the beginnings of it. You can see on this same slide, this famous, it's kind of like a famous bumper sticker now, all over, coexists. Every one of those signs is a sign. In fact, I don't know what they all are. Let's see if we can go through it. We have an Islam sign. I'm not sure what the upside down peace sign is. What is it? Hippies. Well, it's upside down though, and it's like an. Now, I know Satan takes the cross, and if you notice the Catholic cross is bent, it's like bent. If you take it upside down, it's, Satan always turned it down.
My dad always told us the symbol of the broken cross came.
A broken cross, yeah. So, and I don't know what this next one in the middle is. The other one is, of course, Judaism. The S there is the yin and the yang, right? And, of course, the cross at the end for Christianity. And anyway, the whole idea implied there is we can form one religion, because how many have heard this? Very common. All religions basically teach the same thing. It's not true. Well, yeah, today they basically teach the same thing because the church has stopped preaching the Bible. They don't all teach the same thing, or they shouldn't all teach the same thing.